This is Grandmaster's Choice, and I'm gonna go right from this into Game of the Week, and I'm gonna go by a match that recently took place. In fact, it took all these games happened yesterday. The two games I'm gonna go over. They were between the. It was the match between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Fabiano Caruana. So, hey Davina, how's it going? Hey MJ Tahiri. So basically, I'm gonna start with the game between Nepomniachtchi and Caruana. This was their first game from their knockout event. This is the FTX Crypto Cup. I honestly lose track of all these things, and it's it's hard to keep track of them. But it's cool that they have these events all the time, where the formats they play a round robin and then they qualify and then they play knockouts and stuff like that. And it's fun to watch. Again, I really like the candidates and I try to go over those games, but it's fun to go over these games too, and I wanted to switch it up. So the first one is Nepomniachtchi against Caruana, where Nepo was white. It was their first game. So the game went e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6. So as most of you know, hey Petroff, all the people from my stream are here. Very nice. I would say that he's pretty well known for playing the Petroff now. And it's kind of his opening of choice these days. He used it a lot in the candidates. He's used it in the against Magnus, and he was very successful in their match. So if you're looking for someone to model your games after who plays the Petroff, and you want to play it for a win, especially, I'd say that Fabiano is a very, very good choice. So playing the black pieces here. So Nepo takes on e5 and goes back and takes. So Nepo plays d4, which is one of the big lines. You can also play knight c3, and for a while this was quite popular, where takes and d takes c4, and you try to play bishop e3 or f4, queen d2, and castle queenside. And for a while this was quite popular. These days it doesn't seem to be. I'm wondering if someone solved the problem there. I'm honestly not sure. People can also play with queen d2, the idea being to pin this knight. And one little trick I'll show you guys is that a lot of people will automatically play d5 and lose this piece because this guy is pinned. Whereas, of course, the correct move is queen back. And now there's some endgame line involving d3. There's been knight c3 tried, but honestly, these endgames look very, very equal to me. Something like this. And then queen takes queen and bishop e7, and life kind of goes on. But it's very difficult to actually find edge in any of those kind of positions, for the most part, at least in my experience. So Nepo plays d4, which is one of the main moves. Once again, welcome everyone. For those just joining, it's GM Jan Nepomniachtchi against Fabiano Caruana, played yesterday at the FTX Crypto Cup, which is an online event. I don't know which online game you're referring to, Chess King, but I know it's pretty common. So d5, bishop d3, bishop d6. So there are two main branches here. Black can play with either bishop e7 or knight c6. Often they transpose, but for example, knight c3, castles bishop e7 is one of the big lines here. c4, undermining this knight. So that's the whole point, that even though black has a knight here, it often gets undermined. So knight goes to b4, bishop comes back to e2, black usually castles, and now white can play like knight c3 would be the main move. And there's a lot of theory here. There's a lot going on, and it's hard to summarize it all in one go. But I would say it's the less combative line in a lot of ways. So what Fabiano chooses with bishop d6 is the more aggressive line, I'd say, for both sides in some ways. But it's definitely a really, really interesting line. So castles, castles. Oh man, did he really? I think I vaguely remember this. Yeah, the Russian game is the other thing. I think that it's the English speaking world that calls it the Petroff. I think they call it the Russian in other places, but it doesn't really matter. I'm not an opening name expert by any means. So c4, undermining the knight c6, and this is the idea. You put the bishop on d6, which is a more aggressive square, but rather than developing the b8 knight, you put a pawn on c6. So once again, these lines are well known, but it helps to understand what's going on. And the fact is that the bishop is a little bit better on d6, but because you're also less developed on the queen side. So there's pluses and minuses to all of this. And there are many, many lines here When I used to play white in these positions, my favorite line was actually to take on d5, which looks counterintuitive. But the idea is you want to play this and not allow black to take on c4. So here, black's pretty much forced to take this knight. And then bishop g4. And here there are all sorts of really cool variations. One of the ones I like, it goes, I think you play rookie b1 first. Knight d7. Taking this pawn is very risky. So you typically play here. Bishop h5, and then this move rook b5. And I used to love this line when I was younger because you get to sack a pawn. It looks weird to play rook b5, but the idea is that after knight b6, you have this move c4. And the whole point is that because this bishop on h5 hangs, you can't really take on c4. Like, you can take here, but it's a little bit on the risky side because after takes, I think this position is considered pretty decent for white because you can play rook takes b7 and you're very, very active on the 7th rank. And you can't take the bishop back because your bishop hangs. So typically they play bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, d takes c4, and now you slide your bishop back here. And your two bishops provide lots of compensation. You can try to play for a kingside attack. Sometimes you play for a4, a5. You have a lot of different ideas in this position, and I find it to be very interesting. Again, I'm sure there's a reason why you don't see this at the higher level anymore. There's usually reasons for these things. But I remember, back when I played this as white, which was over 10 years ago at this point, I really enjoyed this line. But in this particular game, Nepo plays knight c3, and this also leads to very, very interesting play. So knight takes c3, d takes c4, and bishop g4. This has been a main line forever. For when I learned this was considered a tame line. Like, this was considered to be nothing for white. But I think since then they've found new ideas. So there are many ways you can play this. Nepo plays h3, which is fine. Bishop h5. And now you can play with rook e1, for example. Knight d7, bishop d3, and just kind of develop normally. And this is perfectly fine. But it's also kind of tame. And I would say that if you give black time to develop, complete development, get all the guys out, I don't really see white ever having an advantage here. Because structurally, white has more pawns in the center, but they also have more pawn islands, meaning that they have the a2 pawn and the c3 and d4 pawns. And because black's pawn structure is so solid, there's no weaknesses at all. And it's very difficult to push these pawns. Like, playing c4, d5 is probably just going to weaken white's position more than black's. So I would say that, in general, these positions are quite comfortable unless white can achieve an initiative, unless they can develop some very concrete form of play. So I really appreciate what Nepo does here, because he really kind of takes matters into his own hands. He plays g4 followed by knight e5. And this is, the whole idea is to be aggressive, to try to take advantage of the fact that knight's still on b8. And one of his main plans here is to play with f4 and maybe even f5 and just kind of start storming. And it looks quite risky, but the fact is that black now has to be extremely careful about how they play. So knight d7 is what most people play here. But in general, I looked into this a little bit, and the lines after this, queen f3, for instance. So again, if black does nothing, like, eventually white's gonna maybe just start storming over on this side with something like this, right? Could be very nasty. So black usually plays queen f6, and now simply king g2. And I mentioned this about the pawn structure, but the fact is, white's already grabbed a bishop. So the two bishops here give white at least something in the endgame. Should the endgame be winning for white or anything like this? Of course not. But I feel like here it provides a lasting advantage and at least something annoying that black has to deal with. So Fabiano, again, and you'll notice this about their games, and it's one of the things I like about both of these players, and one thing you'll notice, and one of the reasons I really look forward to a Nepomniachtchi Carlsen match is that they really try to take the bull by the horns. They don't play like the kind of safe, this should lead to equality kind of route, which a lot of players do, understandably, and there's nothing wrong with that. But they really will try to challenge and play the most challenging moves a lot. And a lot of that times that means taking risks and playing risky moves. So here, Fabiano does that by playing bishop takes e5, d takes e5, and then queen a5. And this position I find is actually a really, really interesting one. So Nepo played the move queen d4, which is quite logical, defending the pawn and preventing queen takes c3, preventing queen c5. But I would have been very interested to see this move, f4. So this is really going all out. And again, I don't know how much of this is prep or how much is, them just coming up with it at the board. It's really hard to know. I didn't follow these particular games live, so I'm not exactly sure. But f4 actually I think is quite interesting. Because, for example, queen c5 check simply doesn't work because of queen d4. And if you trade to this endgame, this is just atrocious with f5 coming in. I want to say almost resignable. Like, these pawns are just way too strong. So this would be a disaster. Queen takes c3 looks good because you're hitting the rook and the pawn. And probably if you've never seen this position, you're thinking, well, wait, why is this not very strong? But white has a very simple and quite strong idea here. So I'll give this one to you guys. Make sure we got a few people in the audience coming up with things. So what would you like to do here as white? To be honest, it's not the most difficult question, mainly because there just aren't that many options. We have a bishop and a rook and a pawn hanging. We have to defend some stuff, right? Very good, Doug. So queen b3. And the whole idea is that if you try to take this rook, believe it or not, this is a position where material really just never tells the tale. Because after queen takes f1, you could take with the king, or even the bishop, honestly, is fine too. And these pawns are just rolling right up the board. And there's nothing you can do. b7 is weak, the king is weak, f5 is coming. To be honest, I actually think bishop takes may even be stronger. Because then there's no b5 with tempo, so you have to either drop b7 or walk into f5. And this is one of the examples of the material just not being the most important factor in the position. Here, the main factor of the position is that white's bishops are monstrous, the pawns are moving up the board, b7 is weak. So this position is completely losing. So after queen b3, I think it's necessary for black to trade queens. But when you look at this position, you see how enormous white's play is. They're playing ready for f5, e6. They're ready for bishop a3 and rook out, for example. And I feel like this kind of position, black's just really, really in some trouble. So after f4, I actually think the best option might be the move b5. And I have a feeling that if Fabiano prepared this, this is the move he had in mind. And the idea is that if you try to play bishop b3 now, I can play queen takes c3 and there's no queen b3. So this move is definitely a lot more annoying in this case. I still don't think it's like that clear. Like, I think the game can still go on, but at least after queen a3, queen takes c3, it's not so easy. So after bishop e2 might be a little bit more prudent. And once again, we go for this endgame, but at least because b5 is in, and the bishop is not on this long diagonal, or this very strong diagonal, I think that black at least has some chances. It's very important, of course, they have the move bishop e4, so their bishop doesn't get trapped. But they play this in knight d7, and I think the game is still very much unclear. I probably would take white if I was pressed, just because I still like the position with the bishops. But at least here, it's clear that black's going to at least get some counterplay for them. So f4, I think, would have been a really interesting option for Nepo. Bishop e3, I think, has even been played before, is also kind of interesting, where you basically gambit the e5 pawn to finish your development and get an initiative, is also very interesting. So he played queen d4, and there's nothing wrong with this move. And I think that Fabiano's response indicates this was definitely not in his prep, because I really don't like his response to this move. So if I were black here, I would almost certainly try to get my knight out to a useful square. So he plays knight a6, which is a developing move. But the knight also is just really poor there, and I feel like it's just too slow. So I want to get the knight out to d7, but if you play there immediately, you might be able to, because c3 hangs, but it looks a little bit too cute. Like, I think rook d8 is a perfectly reasonable move. And now the idea is that queen e3, for example, knight d7. And I feel like this is actually a good amount of counterplay for black. If white tries to play f4 here, black has the move knight b6 hitting the bishop, and now bishop to d3. And this move is very annoying because you can play bishop c4 to cut off the bishop, threaten rook d3. And this is kind of a position where I would not be too happy as white, believe it or not. So e6 is maybe the best try, but after f takes e6, so if queen takes e6, king h8, believe it or not, you have problems with the c3 pawn and your king, And the queen on e6 looks nice, but it's not doing much. So taking with the bishop, I think, is stronger. But after king h8, it's just not so easy. You can try, like, f4, f5 is just very loose. You could try for c4, bishop b2, but it all takes a long time. And I feel like if black gets, like, knight e5 in and rook d3, a lot of counterplay could be headed your way very quickly. So I think that this position is just unclear. Like, I really don't think that either side is doing much better there. Bordorf, you mentioned c5. I think it's still too slow. Because I play a move like, say, queen e3 again, and then f4, f5 comes, and I think that you haven't achieved enough. Like, playing knight d7 now is not going to work because e6 is going to be a lot stronger because your knight hangs. And if you play knight c6, I feel like I can play this move. And unlike the position with the knight on d7 and the rook on d8, where I have queen c5 ideas or knight c5 ideas, immediate counterplay, this is not going to be so easy. So I don't think I would recommend this. In the game, he played knight a6. And this was kind of an interesting moment. So I thought before I give you any thoughts or analysis or anything like that, I'd ask you guys what you would do here as white. Because I feel like it's, I don't know, like it's actually a very tricky moment. So what would you guys do here? So white to move. Because what he played in the game was fairly strong, but I'm not so sure it was actually the best. But it's definitely like a very like normal, rational move, I would say. So Bordorf, I actually think it's the opposite. I think if rook d1, I play rook d8 anyway because it's guarded by the queen, right? So you actually get skewered there if you play rook d1. Yeah. It's okay. Yeah, bishop g5 is what was played in the game. That's what Nepo chose. It's a decent move. But I also feel like it's not... It's a little bit too cute. Like the move f4, I think is just direct and very strong. Because now, and a couple of you pointed this out, after rook a d8, queen e3, I don't really see anything too spectacular because f5 is just coming, right? If you try to play queen c5, I can even just trade queens and play f5 and you're just toast. So you probably have to try b5 first to get this bishop off the diagonal. So now if bishop b3, you do have rook d3. This is an important concept because now the rook is very, very strong on the third. And you still have to be careful because g6 will maybe drop. But queen takes c3 is also with tempo on the rook. I feel like this is too dangerous. But instead of that, white can play the move bishop e2. And again, I don't really trust black's position. Black can play the move bishop c2 to not lose the bishop. But to me, this whole thing looks very, very flimsy. And I feel like it's a matter of it's just a matter of time before something bad happens. A move like, an idea like f5, f6 could be very, very, very strong. So I just really don't trust black's position here. I think that this should be quite good. But at the same time, maybe he just didn't see anything here. So it's quite possible that he just didn't like it for that reason. He played bishop g5, which is a kind of a cute move, right? Like you're basically stopping rook d8 and then you're going to play f4, f5. But I do think it gives black a little bit of time. And as we've seen in this kind of position, time is really of the essence because if you get an f4, f5, it's just kind of over. So he plays b5. And now the bishop drops back to e2. Once again, you don't really want to go to b3 here, I don't believe. Because here I think actually you can play with c5, c4. So something like this and then c4. And this is a lot of counterplay because the bishop has to drop back to d1. Which is just a wee bit sad, you know? Like you don't really want to drop back to b1 in a position like this. So I think that this is kind of the issue there. So bishop going back to e2. Whoops, I got yelled at. Bishop going back to e2 is best. And now I'll ask again, so what would you guys do as black here? Because I think that this is a very important position, and I feel like there were a couple of mistakes for both sides. And I'll give you guys a chance to improve for both of them. So here, Fabiano's move, again, I think is just not working. But the reason why is actually very complicated. So while I'm waiting for you guys to come up with a move for black, I would say that when I go over these games, I really try to follow a pattern, which is I look at it for myself first, and then I check with the computer. There are times I don't even check with the computer, and I just go about and present the game with, with mistakes. Like if I go over it myself, there's going to be mistakes in my analysis. Not that there can't be with the computer, but it's obviously less likely. And I try to figure out what I see with my own eyes, right? And, how that compares to what the computer sees. And a lot of the times my own ideas are not as good as the players, of course. But in this case, this was one where I wanted to play this move as black right away. What I think is the best move here. And obviously that doesn't happen most of the time. Fabiano's going to play better moves than me 9 times out of 10 or so. But once in a while, there'll just be a move that rubs me the wrong way. And this one was kind of like that for me. So I'm curious what you guys come up with here. Because there was a move I wanted to play so badly. And I think it's because of how I think about chess in general. Yeah, so I'm with Petroff. I would have played knight c7 for sure. I just want to get this knight back in the game. This knight on a6 is just garbage, and I want to improve it. And I just hate the knight there. And the whole idea is that here, knight e6 is the annoyance. Not so much knight d5. Knight d5 is not a bad move, but knight e6 hitting the queen and bishop is actually quite annoying. Because if you try to play f4 here, I think it's just a mistake. Because I go here, and once I take this bishop and you have to take, my bishop on g6 is so much more secure. So a position like this would not be great. So after knight c7, maybe white would just try to move the queen back or even the bishop back. Maybe this is a sneaky move. But even here, right, like knight d5, knight e6 are both possible. I feel like black has time and is getting counterplay. I was kind of with you that f4 was nice, but at the same time, queen d4 did prevent certain counterplay that black could get. Because black could grab the c3 pawn in those positions, right? It wasn't that simple. In the game, though, Fabiano played rook e8, and this move just rubbed me the wrong way. But what was funny is when I was calculating it, I was like, well, I don't really like this move. Oh, his idea is f4, f6. And I was like, how clever of him. And that's why Nepo in this position played bishop f3. But this is one of those where I turned on the computer and I was like, what? So I'll give you guys an opportunity. After f4, f6 is his clever idea. And the question is, what is the really strong idea for white now? And I'll give you guys a hint, which is that my instinct of the knight on a6 being bad turns out to be correct here, because that's actually instrumental with figuring out this position. So think about that bad knight as you try to consider what you would do with white here. I don't know, Gigi. I would say that honestly, they do have plenty of normal games or bad games and things like this. Even the games that I'm going over now, but like this game between Nepomniachtchi and Caruana, and even the next game I'm going to go over where they play with colors reversed, there's a lot of mistakes, like many mistakes. But that doesn't make it a bad game. It's just two players who are playing a complex position. And I would argue that there are plenty of normal games where, say, the game is actually just very dry and boring and they agree to a draw. This does happen, and it's not necessarily that they're boring players. It's just sometimes that's how the way the game goes, even between guys who are very aggressive. So you can't necessarily say all their games are masterpieces, because for the most part, like, they can have crazy games, they can have normal games, and they can have games where they just blunder. Everything's kind of possible. So you guys are on the ball today. A4 is an amazing move, and you have to do it, because if bishop h4, now I plentifully play f takes e5 and then put my knight on e6, and I think that black's kind of doing fine again. The knight on e6 is just such a strong defender. The bishop on g6 now is very solid. The bishop on h4 is annoying because it keeps the rook out of d8, so probably white's not worse or anything, but I definitely feel like black's doing fine now. So the key move is this move a4, and this is just such a nasty move. Because the main problem is that now, if you take on e5, I simply take back, and you haven't actually helped yourself, because here you still have all the problems after a4, right? So you haven't helped yourself. If you take on g5 and I take on b5, you're just going to get slaughtered by taking on a6 next, because everything hangs. So that's going to be a disaster. Even f5 is actually kind of a funny move after that, but okay, it's obviously not necessary. And then if you try to play like b4 or b takes a4, well, b takes a4, rook takes a4, you're right. If b4, here you actually have the option of simply checking and then taking this pawn on f6. So for example, I don't know, I mean, I think black's just kind of dead, but basically no matter what black does next, you can now take this pawn. And the whole reasoning is that this e2 bishop doesn't hang anymore. Of course, if you try to take the pawn here, your e2 bishop hangs, and you don't really have anything. Yeah, so a4 is quite a move. Yeah, there's actually a funny detail here. Like, I would play bishop c4 check almost for sure. But you can actually just take this pawn, because now if rook takes e2... Oops. You have the move queen c4 check, winning the rook. So if you want to, you can actually just take on f6 as well. So this is just such a nasty move, this a4 move. But it was clearly overlooked by both players, and that's why rook e8 was played, because he was relying on this f6 trick. And it worked. Like, Nepo didn't see it. But this a4 move, when I tell you it's there and I put the knight on a6, it becomes more findable. But you guys still did a great job finding it so quickly. But I would say that it's still... like, it's still very, very complicated to find in a regular game where no one's telling you it's there, right? So, in the game bishop f3 was played. Rook a c8. And now the problem is the bishop on f3 blocks the f pawn, so things just take a bit longer. And in fact, in this position, I would still play bishop g2 with the idea of f4. Would be my choice. He played rook fe1 instead. And now I think Fabiano just gets back in the game. So he plays knight c3. Queen b4 to get out of knight e6. They exchange queens. Knight e6. And we have kind of an interesting position because it looks at first like the two bishops would maybe secure an advantage. But the problem is that black's pieces are so well placed. The bishop on g6, the knight on e6. c5 is coming. All of a sudden, all of black's pieces make perfect sense. And sometimes when you have pieces that all are very, very strong, like these pieces, it means that your position's fine even if there's some disadvantage that you might have. I would also argue that because white didn't get an f4, e5 is a bit of a weakness. So they both play pretty logical moves. Bishop e3 to cover d4 and f4. Black plays c5, of course. Hey, Azan. B takes c5, knight takes c5. Rook e c1 was tried. And this move looks a little funny, but he doesn't want knight d3 coming with tempo. So here, I mean, knight d3 was still played, but the whole point is that now he can take on c8 at least. And there's no rook hanging on e1. That's the whole point. Rook takes c8. And here, Nepo played, in my opinion, a very, very clever move. He plays the move bishop g2. And once again, I feel like this is a tricky scenario. Like, what to actually do here is quite tricky. So what do you guys think? What would you think you would do here? Because I think this was really like an important moment. This is black to play. White just played bishop g2. So it's black to move. And the question is, what would you do here? These are all interesting moves. Do keep in mind, though, that f4 is a big problem. So, for example, if you play a5 here and I play f4, you have to have a very good response to this. Right? Because now f5 is kind of a big threat. So I would say that you have to be very careful with the move a5. And the same problem with a6. a6 also allows bishop b7, by the way. But I think that f4 would be an even stronger move, probably. So Doug mentions rook c2, and I believe this move is the strongest. But it's for a very concrete reason. It isn't just about putting the rook on the second. Putting the rook on the second is nice, but the main idea is that now if white plays f4, what move does black have, which is quite strong? So rook e2 would feel lucky, yeah. If you don't see this move, this is quite something. But yeah, this move is quite good because now if bishop takes a7, you play knight takes f4, and maybe white's not worse after bishop f1, but definitely I think black's position, like black has nothing to really be worried about after something like this, right? So once you take the f4 pawn, black has more than adequate counterplay, I would say. So probably white should instead play the move bishop d5. And this move is pretty decent. But now black can play your move a5, and I think that black's just doing fine here. White has the two bishops, but black's so active. The pieces are good. And notice how f4 is still not a possible move. So you have to be careful. You have to make sure you don't allow f4 in the future. But because you have some time, because you've pushed your pawns, I think that this position is going to be very, very promising. So once again, I don't think that white should be worse or anything like this, but I think that black would be doing just fine here. So after bishop to g2, instead Nepo played the move knight takes e7. And this was, I thought, a very, very crucial moment. Because clearly I think maybe Fabi just thought that after knight takes e5 he should draw easily enough. And he wanted to get this pawn off the board to kill the majority. But I actually think that this is a big mistake in my eyes, probably bigger than it is in the computer's eyes. Computer doesn't like it. It likes rook c2 better. But I would say that I would really, really hate to have this position that Fabi got after knight takes e5, because I feel like it's very easy for a human being to lose it. But do keep in mind, these guys are playing rapid games, right? So they may not even have time at this point. Like, this is not really a criticism of their play, right? This is more just how do we learn from this? And I think that taking on e5 too hastily does allow something very nice for white. So what would you guys play as white here? Yeah, f4 is a very, very nice move. And the whole point is that if you take this pawn first, you're going to allow all sorts of counterplay. The move bishop d3 is kind of interesting here, for one. I could also play the move knight d... Oops, not there. That is not a good move. I could also think about the move knight d3 and preventing f4. And I think that here black should have enough counterplay to draw almost for sure. Like, this position does not feel like white should be in any way trying to win so easily. f4, on the other hand, as you mentioned, Angelos, forces knight c4. Because if you don't go to c4, I'm going to play f5. There's no rook e2 tricks. There's nothing like that anymore. So knight c4 is forced, hitting the bishop. And now I take. And this is one of those funny positions, because this knight on c4 looks like a good piece, but it actually doesn't do very much, and it blocks the rook on c8. So I feel like this is actually a bit of a problem, because black doesn't really want to play bishop c2, rook c1, bishop a4, or something like that. It's a little bit too passive, the bishop on a4. If bishop d3, you allow rook d1 type moves, and that also is kind of annoying. So Fabiano plays f6, which is logical. But now after rook d1, once again, it feels like white's a bit on top. But to actually win this position is not the easiest thing in the world. So Fabiano plays bishop e8. He's basically trying to think about bishop c6 at some point. So Nepo plays bishop d5 check. King f8. And this is a very, very clever sequence by him. So his first move that he starts out with is bishop back to f2. He's simply trying to reposition the bishop. It doesn't really do anything on a7 anymore. He brings it back home. So Fabi plays the move king e7. I think that he really is aiming to play bishop c6, but the problem after bishop c6 here is that you allow the move bishop e6, and this looks very, very annoying. I should also mention that it's possible to play bishop c5 check here, and this might even be better, come to think of it. Because now if king over, I play check. You have to go to d8, I guess, but this is already very flimsy. Even moves like bishop g8 come to mind. So I don't think that he wants this. So his idea is to play king e7. And I don't think this threatens bishop c6 yet, but it does have different ideas, and you're just trying to improve the king, because if rook e1 check, you can simply bring the king up. So I would say that this position is very, very close to being a draw. Not like drawn, but I would say this is a really, really crucial position. So white plays the very, very clever move rook d3. And this move is kind of weird because it actually prevents rook e1 check as a move. But Nepo sees that rook e1 is not really going to be the move he wants anyway. So he plays rook d3 first. And here I'd say Fabi gets a little bit complacent. And the question is, how does this happen? What does he what should he play here? Yes, Divina, f6 was played. You're liking black's position more and more. But what would you play here as black? That's kind of the crucial point. Well, the rook just came from from d1 chess king, so he played rook d3. But this is, what would black play here? So Bordorf suggests knight d6. Let's see. This move I'm not so sure about, because now rook e3 check becomes kind of a thing. Or even rook a3. Like, I feel like you're giving white an opportunity to maybe improve. So something like maybe rook a3 check first, because now the king has to go back somewhere kind of ugly, and then rook a3 is interesting. So now bishop b6 is a thing, as well as rook a7. So this feels like you're giving black a little bit too much. So I wouldn't really withdraw the knight from c4. I think that it's doing its job there at least. h5 is similar to what he played. He played the move h6, which is a perfectly normal move. It just puts the pawn on a non-hanging square. But actually playing a slow move was very, very problematic. Forgot your notation. It's funny. So rook d8, it looks nice, but the problem is now it allows bishop check, and this is definitely very, very scary. So I think here I can just take the knight with check, and that should end the game. So you don't want to play rook d8. Yeah, it's pretty tough to activate the rook, but I think the key is you have to diffuse the bishops in some way. And yeah, Angelos, bishop f7 is definitely the best move. Because you could trade and play rook check, but this just doesn't quite do enough. I can drop my king back to maybe g8 so I avoid bishop c5 check later. And then if rook b7, I play here, and I don't think you're going to quite have enough. I think most likely the game's going to liquidate and be a little bit drawish. You do have to be careful, I guess. Like after here takes... You have to make sure you don't allow like rook b8 check and bishop c5 and stuff like that. But you always have g6 if you need it. You're not really going to get mated here. So this would not be such a big deal. Oops. So bishop f7. So probably white would withdraw the bishop. Somewhere like this, right? And now you have a move like knight b2, activating the knight. And this is quite annoying because the whole idea now is that the rook is ready to come into either c1 or c2 and wreak havoc. If the move rook a3, for instance, you can play b4 even. Rook a7 check, king f8. And the rook's coming in to c1, c2, And black's getting all sorts of counterplay here. And once black's pieces get active, I think it's going to be very difficult for white to really show anything with the bishops. The bishops still look good, but rook c2 and knight d3 is going to be massive, massive counterplay. As far as bishop c6 goes, then I think that you're running into bishop c5 check issues again. So bishop c5 check and bishop e6 or something could be very bad. Something like this, I believe. So after rook d3, Fabi played h6, but the question is, how do you punish this move? It looks like black can afford a slow move if white's just playing rook d3. But there was a very, very sneaky idea with rook d3, and that's kind of what I would like you guys to find. So what is the sneaky idea? A4. Wow. All right, I have to bite. Like what's the idea after I take? You have to have something, right? So rook c3 is your plan. Okay. But here I'm a little bit confused. What happens if I play bishop f7 here? Feels like now you have to try to make a draw on an opposite bishop endgame. Yeah, g4 at some point, but g5, the problem is it's going to liquidate lots of pawns, right? So you have to really time it correctly if you ever want it to do anything. But someone did mention the correct move, which is bishop e1. And I think the key is that it's hard to realize this is the threat and how big of a deal it is. But the fact is, the bishop coming to b4 with check is massively problematic. Because it just kills any squares the black king has, and it makes it so that like you're basically just coming in with all your pieces, and it's going to be really, really nasty. Now, it's important to note that the reason why rook d3 threatened this, is that after king e7, if you try to play bishop e1 immediately, what's the problem? Because at first it looks like this move should do the trick, but black has a resource here. Correct. Knight e3. And at first this looks suicidal because of bishop check. But even if we go king e6, there's nothing really white can do because you're still forked. So any discovery with the bishop. So for example, this move runs into knight takes d1 and you actually just lose a piece. So you're kind of stuck as far as great moves here, I believe. So you have to play something like rook d3 and I take this bishop. And this should be quite drawish. I think the easiest is just king e6 with the idea of rook d6, king back. And I don't think that you should ever lose this position, really. So, yeah. So rook d3 was so clever because it's threatening bishop e1, but it looks like it doesn't have a threat. It looks like rook d3 is just a move. And that's why Fabiano, who obviously is quite strong, just played h6 because he thought rook d3 didn't do anything. So this idea of Nepo's was very clever. But after h6, bishop e1, believe it or not, I think black's already very close to lost because the bishop coming to b4 is that strong. Fabiano tries bishop c6 now, but after bishop b4 check, king e8, now white has to move bishop e6, and this is remarkably strong. Because he plays rook a8, he can't go to d8, of course, why not? Nepo seems to be a decent player, well put. Yeah, there's a reason why he's challenging for the world championship, right? Bishop f7 check, very good. The idea being takes. So he can't go to d8, so he played to a8. And now white simply takes time out to play a3. And this is where it becomes obvious that something has gone horribly, horribly wrong. Because the bishops just completely control black's king. They completely dominate the position. And really, it's just a matter of getting the rook in the game. So this position is already, I would say, pretty much lost for black. And it happened in the blink of an eye. And here Fabiano played rook a7. But what's interesting is that, okay, both players probably didn't have tons of time, although Nepo plays very fast. But I would say one of the things that Nepo does, if he has a weakness, and of course, even the very strongest players have weaknesses, right? Compared to any of my weaknesses, they'd be minuscule, right? Like, but they all have them. And one of the things I would say with Nepo is that sometimes he can be a little bit complacent when he has a winning position, is something I've noticed. Meaning that he has a position, he's played beautifully, he has these bishops, and he makes a mistake which a lot of chess players make, which is you kind of assume the position's going to win itself. I got the two bishops, they're just going to destroy my opponent. So let me win them stuff. So he played the move king f2, which is a nice building move, and I think you'd play on autopilot, and it's definitely not a bad move. However, in this position, he could actually just immediately do huge damage. I mean, it wasn't really his plan, MJ. It was definitely not his plan to play knight e5 to c4. It was more that a concrete thing he missed. He thought that after like knight takes e5, it would be like a little bit simpler. And I think he missed the trick that after rook c2, f4, rook e2 is always there. So with these guys, it's usually not something super basic they're missing. Sometimes it is, but a lot of the times it's something slightly deeper. And also keep in mind that when you're actually playing the game, it's much harder to see all this. I think people underestimate that. H4 is tempting. All these moves are tempting, but I'm not quite seeing... I'm not quite seeing the right move just yet. But I think you guys will get there. Honestly, king f2 is a nice move, right? There's nothing wrong with king f2 by itself, right? It's more that it does give black a little bit of a reprieve for the time being. Right? Like, it at least gives black a little bit of time to repair. And honestly, it's hard to repair this position completely. Rook c3 maybe, but you have to keep in mind, you're not necessarily even wanting to take this knight. Because, like, you look at this position, right? Like, you do something like this. Let's say I play bishop d7, for instance, and you take this knight. You've won a pawn, but you've also ended up in an opposite bishop position, where it's not entirely clear what your winning plan is now if I put my king on f7. Like, how are you going to actually win the position? Your pawn on a3 is not going anywhere. So I would actually argue that if you take on c4, you've actually given away some of your advantage. You haven't increased it. I think, at least in my view, the two bishops are much stronger than that pawn up position. Because the knight on f7 by itself just doesn't do that much. Yeah, so there is a trick here. Bishop f5, so threatening bishop g6, which is, needless to say, a remarkably strong threat. It's practically mate, if not for rook f7. So black has to play king f7. And now, once again, you threaten mate. One of the things I always try to tell my students is that if you can threaten mate in one, you should look at the move. It doesn't mean you're going to play it, especially in an endgame you're trying to win, right? He didn't want to allow the king up, almost for sure. But the fact is that black just does not have a good move here. Because now you're threatening mate, and what would you like to play here? Like, how does black defend against the mate threat? Because you have two ways to do it, but neither one is all that great. So g6 is one, but the drawback with g6, I believe, is that I can play rook f8 check, and then bishop e6. And this is highly problematic, because now I can play rook g8 check, swing the rook back somewhere else, perhaps. So this position is actually hugely problematic. Like, you're probably just going to lose very, very soon. I don't know how else to put it. So that's not going to really work. there are some really funny lines you can do here as well. Because, for example, like I'm just going to play a move for black because there aren't that many great ones, honestly. But let's say black, I don't know, plays like rook c7 or something, right? Some move like this. One of the cool tricks you can do is you can actually play with g5. And believe it or not, here you're probably already mating. Because after pawn takes pawn, for example, pawn takes pawn, I can play check. And you have two options here. You can play king h6, but then I play check. If you go here, this is going to be mate. Power of two bishops, right? And if here, I'm going to play this and mate you this way. Or the other alternative is after rook check, instead of king h6, you play here, and then I simply go here, threatening rook h8. I guess you do have this move. To be fair, I completely missed this. But it would not surprise me if black has some kind of mating idea here. Like, I'd be very surprised if black survives this position. Something like rook check, for example, and then rook here. I guess bishop d7. I probably got careless, honestly, with this. This was a little bit too cute. But this is just an example of one of the ideas white can play. Keep in mind, white's not in a rush. Black has almost no moves here, right? So rook a8, the problem with the rook a8 is it allows rook f7 check. And then I can take on f6 at the very least. So this is also not going to work. Oh, king f6 is also a move. Yeah, Doug makes a good point. You're supposed to check on g8 first before you do this, of course. But it was just more to show like some of the mating patterns you can do. Like more likely after rook c7, you're probably just going to check with the rook and move your rook somewhere. So for example, rook d8, I think would be more likely. And now g5 is maybe in the air. Bishop c3 by itself is going to be very strong. So this is also probably better. I got carried away, right? I just wanted to show like some of the mating patterns that are possible. But obviously I went way too overboard. But that's okay. So bishop e8 is the other move to try to defend. But needless to say, this move is also not great. And I think white can actually just play h4, h5 now. And it's just very sad. Probably black has to play g6, but then you can win a pawn like this. And this is a pawn up position. I don't know. I feel like it's not just a pawn up. Like, you're just going to probably lose very soon. Like, you can take on a3, but something horrible is going to happen to you here. Like, that's usually the way these things work. I don't actually see it right away, though. Interesting. Yeah, I think you can still play for mate. Maybe something like here. So the rook would have to move. And now, oof. Yeah, these are the kind of positions where your king just doesn't live. Like, something just happens to your king and there's nothing you can do about it. But once again, I don't actually see the mate, so... Yeah. So I was thinking rook e7, but then there's this move, I guess. And at the very least, you don't win immediately. Like, you have to work for it. Because h5, king f6, you're not quite checkmating yet. Yeah. Okay, maybe it still takes a bit of time. Not so simple. Yeah. You have a few different options. Honestly, like, I'd have to look at this a little bit further. Maybe something like this actually works. You can also play bishop back to e4, by the way. But in general, this is going to be a very, very difficult defense for black. In the game, he played just king f2, bishop d7, and here, bishop g8, which I think is a really nice move. He's basically just surrounding the king, making sure he keeps the two bishops advantage. And here, Fabiano probably should have tried g5, just to prevent these pawns from coming up, and after f5, rook a6. And at least here with knight e5, the rook covering f6, I feel like there are at least some chances to draw. In the game, he played f5, and this really, really should not work. After g5, hg, fg, g6 was played. And here there are different options, kind of. But once again, I think that Nepo plays a slightly more careless move. And in this case, like, during the, like, when I analyzed it myself, like, again, I wanted to play a different move, but I was surprised by how big the difference actually is. Because believe it or not, like it looks crushing for white, at least to my eyes, but black actually has some resources here. So playing precisely is actually a very, very important thing to do. And once again, I have a feeling it was a position where he didn't feel like he had to do this. And I think that's what ended up, making it so that he didn't do this. But he absolutely should have done this. So what is the best continuation for white here, do you guys think? So rook d6 hangs the rook to knight takes d6. So you have to be a little bit careful. Yeah. So chess king has the right idea. You play h4. And the right idea is actually very, very cool. So you play g6. You play bishop c6. And here you play h5. Takes and g6. But what's really sweet about this is what is your actual threat here? Say I play the move rook g7. This is the really cool part for me. What is your actual threat here? So yeah, bishop f7, which looks like a good move, but I take. And now what? Bishop h7 may actually work just because the bishop c3 threat is good, but you have something better here. Black definitely has pawns. Yes, I think you see it now. Yes. And now you just get a queen. So that's kind of a nice little trick. Because if you end up just taking back and I take back, you're not really doing a whole lot here. This is actually very likely a drawn position, I would say. It's 2 pawns for the exchange, right? But rook d8 just is absolutely crushing. So very, very cool. And there's no way to stop this threat. That's why it's so strong. So Nepo plays king g3, which again, it looks like just a normal move. Everything's nice, blah, blah, blah. But the question now is, so Fabiano plays rook a6, and then he kind of loses pretty quickly. But it turns out he could have played the move bishop c6. And now let's say white goes about this idea again. You play bishop e4. The rook comes to d7 next. And believe it or not, I actually think black's totally back in the game. White's still better, almost for sure, but this is a game now. And notice how it's because of one slow move. Instead of king f2, he could have maybe done something really strong by force. Instead of king g3, he could have played h4, h5. So it's kind of like, some players I think are the opposite. Some players, like Fabi, for example, if he were white, he would almost certainly try to make h4, h5 work. That's kind of his style, is to be very concrete. And sometimes when you're playing technique, you can go overboard with that kind of stuff. And I think that it's important to be simple when you're trying to win a position if you can. But there are also positions where you really should play quickly. And I think this is one, because now black's kind of getting untangled. Black's getting his pieces out. Black's activating. And I think that when your opponent is passive, sometimes you have to strike before they can become active. And yes, exactly. You have to see this whole line when you play h4, h5. It's not that it's that simple, right? But I think that someone like Nepo sometimes veers the other direction. He'll try to be very, very simple. But the problem is sometimes simple is just not as effective, especially if your opponent can untangle. So very, very interesting. And I don't mean to generalize about the players. Of course, they can both make mistakes in both directions, right? But I would definitely say that king f2 and king g3 are both very natural moves, which turn out to be slight errors. But after rook a6, h4, I think that black's just kind of hosed. Rook here. And then one last final point, which is really funny, is he can play bishop h7 safely. He probably should play bishop f7, but now after h5 takes, you take here, and this is just very, very good for white. Bishop d7 check is a monstrous threat here. And the g-pawn's very strong. So this would have been very good. He played king f7, and now rook d8 was tried. And this is just absolutely crushing, because if you try something like king g7 check, king g7, now you actually do get mated with this. You can't take the bishop because of rook h8. And after this, you get mated this way. So a very, very cool checkmate. In the game, he played rook takes a3 check, which is probably the best try. But this position was just not that difficult. Rook d6 is a nice move, the idea being he takes g6. And this is just too much. Rook behind the pawn. He trades off the bishops. I'm fast forwarding a little bit, but basically the rook just kills the knight here, because you basically just don't allow black in with the king, and then your pawns just win. Because if f2, king g2, you're not really doing much here. So this would have been all she wrote. So after g6, Fabi resigned. So quite an interesting game. The next two games after this were draws. And so then the fourth game, in order for Fabiano to save the match, he had to win with this final game with the white pieces. And that's what we're going to look at now. So this is the final game of the first day. The second day, by the way, today, they also tied 2-2, and I think Nepo won in tiebreaks, I want to say. Is that what happened? Anyways, I didn't follow as closely because I was working most of the day. But that's kind of how it works. All right. So e4, e6, d4, d5. So this is their second game. I'm going right into my game of the week lecture, which is this game. So e4, e6, d4, d5. This is game 2, game 4. So we have this advanced French, which they played quite a bit of, actually. Knight c6, knight f3. And here there's a kind of a branch. So the main line for quite a while, and it's still one of the main lines, is queen b6. This is probably the most common move. And the idea now is if bishop d3, you play bishop d7, and you can, of course, go for this, but it is a pawn sack, right? I can now grab this pawn. And there's a whole bunch of theory here after like knight c3, I think, is the main move. And life kind of goes on. But this is like a very, very sharp pawn sack. If you could play bishop e2 here. And then the idea is I play cd followed by knight e7, and the knight comes to f5. Or you can play a3. And here I play c4, knight bd2, knight a5. And this is kind of the main line. But one of the things I would say is that this queen on b6 now doesn't make that much sense. It's just not the most logical piece, because the queen kind of wants to be back on c7 or something here. So given this, one of the clever ideas for black is to play this bishop d7 move. So in the game, Fabiano plays bishop e2. But one of the kind of clever ideas with this move, if bishop d3, you can still play takes in queen b6 or something along these lines. It's still quite playable. And the whole idea is that if you play with a3 here, and I play... So f6 is also a move here, which is quite interesting. Because the queen's still on d8, it's a little bit more playable. But here you can also play this knight a5, and the whole point is that now black's queen can go to c7, where it's a lot more logical in these positions than on b6. So just kind of a little bit of a tidbit for you guys. However, after bishop d7... Fabiano plays bishop e2, and this is one of the lines where you can see why, if the queen were on b6, this knight coming to f5 would carry more sting with it, because it would already make big threats, whereas here it doesn't. So it's kind of like a subtle little thing. But okay, knight a3. I know there's a never play f6 thing, but honestly, if you're going to play the French, you got to be willing to play f6, and we'll get to that. So cd, cd, and this position, Nepo plays a very interesting idea, which is f6. So the main line here goes knight f5, knight c2, queen b6. And you kind of transpose to these other lines a little bit. Castles, and then either bishop e7 or any number of moves, right? Like this is a very common position. This is kind of the normal way to play. And I think that they played similar to this in a game that happened later. But in this game, Nepo plays f6. I should also point out that for the set, right? For this, this match, this game is basically a must-win game for Fabiano. So, and I want to point this out because Nepo, who only has to draw to save the match, is not playing Berlin. He's not playing one of the most solid lines. He's playing the French, and he's playing it this sharply. So I feel like this is something to kind of note about Nepo, that even if he's in a must-draw game or whatever, he can still play very, very aggressively. But f6 is actually quite a logical move here because you're trying to undermine the center, and you're trying to do it very quickly. So this f6 move is quite rare. In my database, it had only been played once, and it had been played, believe it or not, by Simon Agdestein, the Norwegian player, and former coach of Magnus Carlsen, against none other than Magnus himself. And Magnus here played the move castles, which is kind of the move I would veer towards. I don't like developing my opponent's guys, so I much prefer this move. And the drawback to it is that you can get a slightly weak e5 pawn. So this happened in the Magnus game, knight c6, but here he played the very exciting move, knight b5. And I think that this is actually quite promising for white. a6 was played, and here knight d6 check is actually quite interesting because I don't think it's so easy to win that pawn back. There are other moves as well, but Magnus played the even more interesting bishop d3. The idea being queen h5 check. Because here, if you try to go for this, you actually just get mated. Let me do it the fun way. I'll take it with the queen, because we can. And this is checkmate. So just as a fun little line. So of course, Agdestein played g6 instead, and ended up winning the game, but I do feel like Magnus had a very promising position. He played queen g4 here, knight takes e5, queen g3, and the game just was quite insane. But definitely white had a very promising game. So I kind of would have preferred this, honestly, to what Fabiano did as white. But what he did is also quite interesting. He plays takes on f6. And the reason I don't like this is because after g takes f6, now bishop g7 is a thing and trying to castle. So again, I'm not saying objectively castles is so much better. It's more like my preference would be to play castles. Yeah, Fabio, that's a good point. Like, I don't love taking on f6, but it's also still very, very much possible. The one thing I would say, though, is that I definitely don't like our knight on a3. So I might have taken the moment here to play knight b5, which looks like a threatening move. And the idea is, yes, you're stopping bishop g7, because bishop g7 runs into check and takes this pawn and knight c5, and this is the disaster, of course. So you have to defend against it by either moving the knight, or maybe queen b8 is actually the most prudent. And here I like to castle, and the idea is that your knight can just drop back to c3 when it wants to now. But okay, black still plays bishop g7 and has a decent game. I just really don't want my knight on a3. So my temptation is to play knight b5. In the game, he simply castled bishop g7 and now knight c2. And this was a really interesting moment because I think Nepo castled, I'm sure, very quickly. And I think most players would. But I actually think that he could, if he stopped to think here, he might have thought about playing a move like a5. Which looks like a very strange move, but the main idea is that this b4 idea that white gets in the game is extremely annoying. And sometimes, even when you're ready to castle, and it looks like castling is what you should do, there are times when an idea is so annoying, you should actually put a stop to it before you castle. And this is one of those times. Like, I really think that a5 is a very interesting move. I would definitely consider it at the very least. And I'm not saying it's that clear, but I definitely think I would strongly consider it. Because after castles, Fabiano plays b4, and this pawn push is just so annoying. Because now, if you ever play e5, you have to worry about this pawn coming to b5. And the pawn on b5 just makes black's life kind of miserable. But this is a very, very interesting moment. So he plays a6, which is also a move I'm unsure about, because I don't think that a6, a4 helps black in any way, really. I think that probably leaving the pawns was a bit wiser. But it's very complicated, so we're going to actually move past it for the moment. But the key is what to do after e5, because this was a moment where Fabiano's move surprised me greatly. But I was less surprised when I tried to calculate this position and I realized how very complicated it was. Um, so I don't exactly know what I would do here, but I'm curious what you guys would do. What I know is that Fabiano's move is probably not best. It's a little bit, I don't know. It's not really in the spirit of the position, I don't think. So what would you guys do here as white? Because to me, this is a very, very difficult position to play. Yeah, knight e3 is interesting. The drawback is it does drop b4, so I might be able to take that pawn. But I also might just play e4 and f5, and these pawns rolling up the board would make me very, very nervous with the knight on e3, I would say. So I don't know if knight e3 is what I would choose. Yeah, playing b5 is not so bad. If they take on b5, a takes b5, knight takes a1, you're actually not that unhappy with that development, I don't think. Um, or I think actually you can even take on c6 or think about it. No. I'm trying to think actually. Takes. Yeah, I think this line in general, yeah, takes on c6, takes on c1. So you take back. But yeah, this I think is definitely not bad for white. Definitely kind of decent. I was looking at the move knight a5, but even this is actually not so easy. But I think you could play this way, and then maybe just rook b1 to stop knight b3, e4 and knight h4. And the idea is you can maybe play f4 at some point, or g3 and try to control the f4 square. So that's kind of the question. And it's interesting because what the computer likes is something which didn't occur to me right away, but actually is very logical when you look at it. And it's one of those where I think at least one of these guys, for me to come up with it would be more difficult, but I think one of these guys could kind of do it. And it's actually to take. So taking looks very counterintuitive because you give black these pawns. But the fact is, you at least don't have this horrible weakness on d4. And I would say that black at least has something to prove now because black's king's more open and stuff like that. But the key is you have this move rook a3. And this move is very, very logical because you're trying to bring the rook over to the queen side, to the king side to be able to attack. So e4 looks scary, and playing knight d4 I think has some risks to it. But you can actually play knight g5. And the thing is, because the d5 pawn always hangs, the e7 knight can't move. And that makes life very annoying. So black should probably get rid of this knight. But even if you go to h3, knight f4 is possible, rook g3 is sometimes in the air. And I would say that this position is actually quite promising for white. Because these pawns look very nice, but they're also not going anywhere. So I don't know. It's one of those where it's very, very difficult to evaluate this kind of thing. But I would say that probably black is actually has to be very, very careful here. Because once again, like, you have to really watch out for like rook g3, bishop h6 ideas and stuff like that. Like, you could end up losing very, very badly here if you're not careful. So at the same time, this was not intuitive for me at all. I wanted to play b5 as well. And I don't think it was for Fabiano. So he ended up choosing bishop a3. So he's trying to play b5 in a more clever way. But I think that this is just too dangerous because Nepo plays e4 and then f5. And this looks very scary to me. But one of the things I've noticed with Fabiano's play is that he's very brave. Like, he doesn't get scared by pawns shoving up the board at him. Like, it just doesn't bother him very much. And a lot of players like myself would be just utterly terrified here. I agree, Angelos. Like, I had a very, very difficult time with d takes e5. But at the same time, it makes sense in that the pawns don't really go anywhere too quickly. And the pawn on d4 now is just kind of a weakness that you have to deal with all the time. And I definitely like the idea of getting the rook out. Because right now, the bishop and rook are just not really playing. And black's king is very, very safe. Whereas our own king might not be safe for very long. So here, knight b3. And this was a position where I think Nepo played a move which I'm not as crazy about. So I'm kind of curious what you guys would do here. Yeah, but I would say, guys, like the one thing I would say about the d takes e5 line, and I'm not saying I would have played it myself necessarily, but I think that when you realize that your deep 4 pawn is such a horrible weakness, and that now f4, f5, f4 is coming, the pawn on e5 and the pawns on e5 and d5 don't look nearly as scary, because these pawns coming up the board here look really, really nasty. b5 is quite an interesting move, actually. I have to admit, I did not consider this. Yeah, and I'm not exactly sure what happens now. Maybe white just plays knight c5. But this is definitely an interesting idea, b5. I don't know if you meant it for black or for white, but... yeah, I'm with you guys. I think f4 is quite a strong move. And I think he was worried about the move b5, and I think this is what Fabiano was banking on. But I think black can actually just put the knight back on a7, and it's not so easy to actually take advantage of this. And in the meantime, f3 is going to be like bone-crunching type of threat. So I think white has to be very, very active and play knight c5. But here you can even just drop back to c8. And the idea is that if you try to play bishop g4, I can play knight f5. And everything kind of glues together. And these e4 and f4 pawns are still there and are going to be very, very, very strong. Once again, f3 is going to always be in the air. The queen's going to come out to g5. It's definitely not clear. The knight on a7 does look kind of silly. But at the same time, I think that takes and b6 can come later, forcing the knight away. The b5 pawn might be weak. And once the knight leaves, like black can play rook f6 to g6, for example. There are just so many promising ideas here that at the very least I would be very, very nervous. In the game, he played the move knight g6, which seems very rational, but I think that it's a bit inaccurate. So here, I don't know. I think that this was actually an important moment for me. Excuse me, yes? So, Fabiano played the move f4. And I don't mind the idea. I think the idea is correct. But I would have almost certainly played b5 first. Because now after knight e7, you take and play f4. This looks very, very annoying. Because bishop takes a4, bishop takes e7 wins a piece. So you don't have to worry about that. And now knight c5 comes next. And I feel like this is kind of a better version of events. He plays the move f4 himself first, but the problem now is you give black an extra opportunity to do something on the queen side. So let's see. Yeah, knight g6 does not stop b5. His idea is that he didn't want to put the knight on a7, right? So he plays knight e7. That's the whole idea. Knight g6 was to give the e7 square to his knight, so he didn't have to play knight a7, which is quite logical. But in this position, Fabiano played a move which dumbfounded me. Like, I don't think I would consider this move in 1,000 lifetimes. And it was quite surprising. If you mean b5, f3 farther back, like quite a few moves back, I think that it, like f3, I can probably take it and you don't have immediate mate or anything like that. But it's definitely something to consider. And by the way, I'm not asking what did Fabiano play, because I don't think it's a very good move. I'm asking what would you play here as white. G4 would definitely be surprising. And what's funny is that his move is kind of bad for concrete reasons in addition to kind of positional reasons, but the positional reasons is why I would not play it. Yeah, I mean, knight c5 is what I would choose as well, probably, right? Like, just get your knight in the game. Knight takes b7 is a thing, b5 is a thing, and I think that Fabiano by all counts, is totally in the game. I don't think that anything terrible has happened to him. However, instead he played the move a5. And this move, I just don't... Like, b5 I would understand. I don't know if it's good, but I would understand b5. You're opening up the bishop, you're getting your pieces in. a5, I understand he's kind of securing the c5 square for his knight, but like to do this to your a3 bishop is really, really sad. But Nepo's response, I think, would be what Fabi maybe missed, because I'm assuming his plan was to do this, play knight c5 and play b5 or something, and then even though this looks a little silly, it maybe would justify itself at some point. Again, I have real doubts about this. Honestly, Doug, I feel like a5 might be a misclick. It's so hard for me to imagine him playing this move. But at the same time, Nepo's response is very precise and very strong. So see if you can find it. Black to play here, and what is a very precise and strong move. Bishop a4, very, very good. And the main problem is he'd love to play knight c5, but now you can simply take this pawn with check, and this is going to be very bad. So I think that he was banking on knight c5 here, and then he realized it doesn't work. So instead he played the move knight e3, but this is a very sad move because now he's basically pitting himself. And here I think that black has an exceptionally strong move. So Nepo played queen c7, which is not like a terrible move, I guess. But it's definitely not my move of choice. I think that black has an incredibly strong move here. And what I like about this move is that it's extremely positional as well as tactical. And the main thing is ask yourself what white wants to do here. So bishop takes d4 is an example of a move which I would really hate to play, because now after queen takes d4 and bishop b2, all of a sudden I'm in business. I'm threatening queen g7 check, which you can defend, I guess. You can play rook f7. But look at my bishop and queen. Look at all my ideas. I can try to play h4, h5 here. Like, I feel like this is a way to like try to lose almost. It sounds drastic, but I feel like this is a way you can easily just lose if you're black. So I would definitely not want to take the d4 pawn. Knight c6 is a logical move, but now I can play b5, and then I'm not even just trying to grab an exchange. I'm trying to free my bishop. And I feel like this is also something you don't want. So his move kind of prevents that. So once again, if you give white a free move, they'll almost certainly play the move b5. Or some move along those lines. And I think that that's going to be pretty annoying. Maybe even, like, rook c8, maybe you have to play bishop b2, but... they can't play it yet, right? Like, in this line with bishop d4, you have to play rook f7 first, right? And here, I guess if h4 there's knight c6, that's a great point. But maybe I can play b5 first, for example. The main issue here is that you've allowed my bishop and rook to become, like, bishop and queen to become very strong. And I just don't think this is something you should even consider doing, because you have such a huge positional advantage here that I would never ever think of giving up my positional advantage for that d4 pawn. Like, it just would never ever occur to me, because my positional advantage is so great that I don't want to grab a pawn like that, like, ever, and make my opponent's bishop like, look at this. You're turning this a3 bishop from the worst piece on the board to, like, the best piece. It's just not something you want to do. So even like the biggest pawn grabbers in the world wouldn't really want to take that pawn. Yeah, I'd probably take white as well in that line. So b5, very good, is extremely strong here. And the main idea is that you're basically crushing this bishop. And you're also stabilizing the bishop on a4. So, sure, white could play a move like this, but now if you can just take and grab this pawn. And this pawn is a very easy one to grab because you're not really giving up anything to grab it. So b5, I think, is just an incredibly strong move because you're killing every b5 idea white has. And if instead white plays a takes b6, queen takes b6, now you have two weak pawns, and the queen on b6 is remarkably strong. So b5 is an excellent move in my opinion. In the game, he played queen c7. Keep in mind, knight takes f4, rook takes f4 was a thing. But now he's maybe threatening it. So Fabiano plays rook c1, and then queen d6. So Nepo's idea I would call clever, because you're basically saying, well, now your a3 bishop hangs, so you can't play b5. But this doesn't feel as clear to me. Now white plays g3. Rook a c8. And here Fabi finds a very, very good move. And it's a typical move, like not so difficult to find, I feel, but it's definitely by far the best and keeps him in the game. Because again, white's the one in trouble here, not black. So white has to stay in the game. When you have a weakness like this pawn on d4. And remember this position, by the way, because d takes e5 to all of us seemed like, oh man, how could white play d takes e5? But when you realize how weak this d4 pawn is and how this whole thing came about, at some point you're going, maybe d takes e5 is not so bad, right? Especially if black could have gotten an f5, f4, yeah? Yeah, I mean, knight c8 to d6 in that position would have been maybe very tempting. I agree. But okay, this position white to move, what would you guys think about? Remember, you're trying to stay in the game, right? You're in trouble, but you need to stay in the game. You got to keep tension. You got to give yourself ideas. You got to get your pieces into the game. So how would you go about it? Rook c5, very good. Because again, you got to keep tension. And the idea of this move is you're now threatening b5. b5 is now a very, very strong threat. And you're basically, your whole goal is to open up your a3 bishop. So after rook takes c5, b takes c5, now you're really just trying to open up that bishop a little bit more. So black plays the move queen e6 to try to hold on to all the pawns, which is quite logical. And here, Fabiano plays a move which I believe, like, a computer will say this move is a mistake, but I think most strong human being players would play this move, not without thinking, but would play this move pretty easily. And the reason why is because they're trying to free their pieces, and to leave the pieces like this just is so unnatural. So he plays the pawn sack c6. I feel like any human player would just play this move. If they see it. Because it's just, you gotta get your guys out. You gotta do something. But a computer will call this move a mistake. The real question, though, is how should you recapture this pawn if you're black? Because you obviously want to take this pawn. But you have four options. You could take it with the bishop, the pawn, the knight, or the queen. And which option is the strongest option? And that is the question I am currently posing. Yeah, rook b1 was probably a bit passive. You have to deal with rook c3 type moves then as well, because it hits the knight, and if you defend it, the b3 knight will hang. So take it with the queen stops knight c5. I would argue that knight c5, okay, if bishop takes, then yeah, knight c5 is maybe his intention. And I would guess that white gets some counterplay. Maybe you could even think about taking out e7 first. That's a tougher question, but like knight c5 and you get counterplay for sure, right? So that's something. Although bishop takes is probably not so horrible. Queen takes is what was played in the game, but I don't think it was best. If b takes c6, I think like if knight c5 immediately, I take and take here, and this I think is good for black. But I think the move that would worry me after b takes, what was it? Because knight c5 I don't think works. But there was a good move here. I'm trying to recall now. Maybe it's actually bishop takes a6, because the whole idea now is that now knight c5 is actually kind of a thing, which you have to deal with. So maybe you could take this pawn. I guess white could take this. Black could take this, but maybe your a pawn becomes problematic. Even this looks pretty good for black, to be honest. But I feel like it's not the clearest. So queen takes c6 was played in the game. But again, not the best. I think there's actually, the best move is actually knight takes c6. And the idea is that after bishop takes f8, you have to take with the correct piece. If you take with the king, then knight c5 is embarrassing, because knight takes c6 is check. So instead, you should play knight takes f8. But here, knight c5 just doesn't work because it loses the piece. And believe it or not, I think white's just in huge trouble, because I'm going to take on d4 next. And the two connected pawns in the center are just going to roll. And it's one of those cases where being up the exchange is not nearly strong enough. That having those central pawns rolling up the board is going to be much more meaningful, and will probably just destroy white's position here. Because knight takes d4 is a huge threat. If you play queen b1, I take. Knight takes d4. You have to defend your bishop. And now, again, probably different ways, but I think maybe the simplest is even just to take this guy and play d4. d4, you can't play queen c4 because your knight hangs. c4 is coming next, and I think this is just going to be bad. So I think that knight takes c6 would have actually been extremely strong for Nepo, and he likely would have just won this game. As it happened, he played queen takes c6, and now Fabiano plays bishop c5, which is a good move, keeping d4 nice and defended. Rook c8, he unpins himself, and now bishop b5. Knight c1, and this is excellent play by Fabiano, because he's not just, he's like really fixing his pieces. Because after bishop e2, knight e2, you look at white's pieces, and all of a sudden they're actually quite good. Like the knight on e3 and e2, the bishop on c5. All of these pieces are actually quite good here. So I think that this is just a reasonable position almost. Like we're actually getting a position which is quite good. Keep in mind also, this is a must-win game. So not only was he fighting for his life, he has to win this game in order to survive. But we're not nearly done with the complications here. So queen b3. And already we're getting to the point where Nepo has to be very careful, because Fabiano's reorganizing his pieces, and this is something he does remarkably well. Once he knows where his pieces are headed, he's very good at maneuvering them there in the correct order. So this position, I actually think black already has to be quite careful. I really think he should pitch this d5 pawn with knight c6, which looks like an insane move. But the idea is that if knight takes d5, you can actually play knight takes a5, because knight e7 check and knight f6 check, you just move the king, and you actually don't achieve very much because your queen hangs. So you could play the move queen a2, but then I could play queen f7 and kind of pin your own knight. So this would be actually quite interesting. Maybe he could try rook b1 instead. But now you can still play knight takes a5. And after queen a2 here, now there's knight c4 type stuff. So the queen a2 here is not as strong. So instead, I think queen b6 was the move. The idea being you want to win the b7 pawn. But knight c4 trading off the strong e3 knight at least is kind of unclear. Because say you trade off this knight and take here, I would say this position is probably decent for white, but it's also not like super clear. So I don't know. I feel like black's at least in the game because you've traded off the e3 knight, which is quite strong. All right, so queen to b3 and king h8. So king h8 and now rook b1. And the problem here is that king h8 looks like kind of an auto move that you play just to get out of the pin. But the drawback is now you're kind of playing the same lines except you're a tempo down. So here maybe he could give rook c7 a try. It's strange, but at the same time, it's kind of the kind of play you do when you don't realize you have to be like that careful. And they're easy moves to make kind of on autopilot. Like king h8, you could make on autopilot, but then you realize things are tricky. So I actually think rook c7 might be the best try. The idea being if bishop b6, you go back. But I think now white brings the knight in and tries to take on d5. And here, probably knight f8 to try to play knight e6. But at least here you're just losing your d5 pawn, which is actually not the bad pawn to lose. And again, maybe black's kind of in the game still. He plays knight c6, but now after queen takes b7, he's lost this crucial b7 pawn. I think he has some problems. So knight takes a5, rook to d7, and this position I actually think is really, really bad. And the main reason is because he just has numerous weaknesses. The d5 pawn's a weakness, the f5 pawn's a weakness, and I think that this position is actually incredibly bad. And it's amazing how quickly it happened. Like, keep in mind here, like rook c5 was like a fighting for his life type of move. But all it takes is a few mistakes. Queen takes c6 instead of knight takes c6, which would have been very strong. Later in the game, not playing knight c6 when he had to. And it just takes one little mistake after one little mistake. Fabiano playing like really, really good moves as white. And it now all of a sudden, he just has a problem. So this position after rook d7, I think, is actually quite bad. So Nepo tries to play knight b3, which is a fairly reasonable approach, trying to create counterplay. Knight takes f5. And this position is already quite nasty. I think he should try taking this bishop. And then white probably should take on g7. But at least here I felt like there's some counterplay, there's some chances. But this was actually an important moment. So he plays bishop f6. White plays bishop d6, which I think is incredibly strong. And black plays a5. And now this endgame is actually remarkably complicated. And this moment in particular is a very, very important one. So I think that white has a very, very strong continuation here. But this is a moment where I think that actually Fabiano went a bit astray. So see if you guys could find a good move for white to play. Because I think white actually has an incredibly strong move here. Yeah, the a-pawn you have to be careful of. So bishop e5 looks very tempting, but you have to be very, very careful of this move. Yeah, I mean, rook a7 is what was played in the game, and then h5 was played by Nepo, and the game kind of continued. But I think that here, white missed a really promising option. Well, rook b7, I think you could play a4. Like, I don't think you're stopping the pawn from running. G5 is not a legal move. You can try g4 to g5. That's kind of interesting. I don't know if it's the clearest option, but it's definitely possible. Rook b7 allows a4. I don't know if I would allow that if I were black. Bishop a3 is the wrong direction. You're trying to be aggressive here. Hey, Darkon. Again, not so clear. I think it's very slow, and you give black time, they're gonna get counterplay. Keep in mind also that knight takes d4 is a thing. G4 is interesting. I kind of like g4, g5, but I don't think it wins immediately. Like, I still can fight on. Maybe knight h4 type moves are actually annoying sometimes. I'm not sure. Like rook d8, and if you move the rook, knight h4, something like that. Yeah, rook f7 is incredibly strong. So, so bishop d8 it would be the move to save the bishop. But here white can win pretty easily. So why can't he play bishop d8? Yeah, rook f8 or bishop e5 check does the job. Knight takes e5, rook f8. If king g8, then here. So this actually wins. But your line does remind me of this. So I didn't look at this before, but I just saw it. So after rook c2, you could actually play your line. After rook takes f6, takes e2, this is actually a beautiful way to mate. Rook f8. Check and mate. This would be a beautiful way to end the game, no? I mean, come on. This is the way to end the game. So yeah, rook f7 would have been incredibly strong. So I mean, black basically has to just pitch the f6 bishop. But if you pitch the f6 bishop, you're going to lose, right? You could try a3, bishop, rook takes bishop, and then try to do something active. But quite honestly, you're not getting anywhere. For example, you could try this. But quite honestly, like, nothing is going to work here. You could even play bishop a3 if you just want to kill it. But yeah. So rook f7 would have been a really nice opportunity. Instead, he played rook a7, which is not as accurate. And now Nepo plays a good move, in my opinion, h5. I don't know objectively, like, again, I really disregard computer here because white's so crushing, kind of. But it's one of those things where h5 to me is a great human move because you're giving your king luft. You're giving your king a square, and it means that you have a better shot. But here, once again, white has a very, very strong move that he could have played. Yeah, exactly, Angelos. Like, it's easier for us to see rook f7. It's still not simple. But if he has time and if he knows there's a move, of course, they're going to find it real fast. These guys are strong. And much faster tactically than all of us. But at the same time, if you're not necessarily looking for it, if you don't realize there's something that powerful, it can be quite tricky. And it still is a very, very crushing position. But you'll see soon enough how if you don't find the crushing blow soon enough, sometimes it disappears and then it's not so easy. I don't know about that though. I feel like rook f7 you find eventually, right? Just because it's the most forcing move. But the question is what to do here. Bishop c7 is possible, although I do think I can play bishop d8 there. And that might at least be somewhat problematic, like I still fight on. It truly is, but then the thing is you can still see them miss simpler things that sometimes we would see. So it kind of makes you realize though that how many dimensions there are to chess strength, because chess strength doesn't mean they're going to see the things we miss every time or that we're incapable of seeing things that they don't see. It's more that if you know like the amount they see as they play, it's quite difficult to fathom, I would say. But at the same time, especially when they're playing rapid and blitz, they make quite a few errors. So the games are kind of closer to what we would think of as playing, like us playing, right? So, because again, I mean, obviously, I'm a GM. I can play at GM level, but the difference between my level and these guys is still quite large. Like it's hard to explain like how big of a gap it actually is. King f2 d3 again is very slow. I don't like it. You want to look for things that are more aggressive first, right? I don't know. G4 gambiting that pawn. I feel like you have to get something very clear for that. And by the way, guys, it's not an idea you haven't seen. So I feel like you guys are looking for too subtle. You know, king f2 d3. These are all nice improving moves, but look for your forcing moves first, right? You guys are trying to be a little bit too intricate. Yeah, rook f7 again is quite strong actually. Because the bishop doesn't have, it has to move here and then you go here, and this knight just runs out of moves. Because the bishop coming to e5 is going to be crushing, right? So this actually wins in the same way. I still like Nepo's h5 move, because if you don't see rook f7, h5 is a good try for a defense. But sometimes you just have to allow one move which wins and crushes you. And that's sometimes part of defense. You allow one move that crushes you, but not every move doesn't crush you, right? And that's kind of the point. So I didn't mean to trick you guys, but rook f7, it's a similar idea, right? But it's the same thing. So in the game, however, he played bishop e5, and this I definitely don't like, because now the game becomes incredibly messy. And remember I talked about before how maybe one of Nepo's issues with technique was sometimes he gets a little lackadaisical. Again, by these guys' standards, not by normal standards. But he sometimes will, like he just played king f2 and king g3 rather than the moves which were more precise. I would say Fabiano sometimes is on the other side, which is he doesn't fear complications at all. He believes in his calculating ability, and he tries to be very precise. The problem with this sometimes is that you end up choosing lines which are very, very complicated for no reason. And this was a position where he had something very, very simple. Only the bad ones. That's funny. So he plays bishop takes e5. And here I actually think that Fabiano should take with the f pawn, just to keep this d5 pawn under control, and he gives the f4 square for his knight. I think this would have been still quite good for white. He plays d takes e5, which I think is really, really risky, to be honest. So Nepo plays rook c2, and now I think the game's just a mess again. Because knight d4, knight takes, rook d2, knight f5. So it looks quite good for white in that you have the, like black's king on h8 is quite bad. You have these pawns, the knight on g6 is bad. But black also has lots of passers here. And after d4, I would at least be marginally worried. So this position maybe even should be drawn with best play. So both guys are kind of playing forced moves. So Fabiano plays e6. There's no real way to stop this pawn. So black plays e7, e3. But the drawback here is these pawns of black's are also not so easy to stop. He plays e7, so he must capture it. Sacrifice the knight. Rook takes e7, a4. But now the trouble is, how do you actually stop these pawns? And how would you stop them? So here you guys have lots of decisions to make to end this game. So if you play knight h4 here, I think this a pawn's going to beat you to the punch. Because now if you try check, and here, this a pawn's already to queen. If you go here, so if I play rook b2, you might have a point. Maybe f6 wins, because if check here, queens, you get to finish with the beautiful rook g7 mate. The problem with this is that I think I can stop you. I can play a move like rook f2, for example. And now your pawn's not moving, and I'm ready to play d3, d2 on you. So this actually looks problematic. If you try to play knight h4... I mean, while pushing the pawn. Oh, well, black's knight is on g6. Okay, you're talking way farther back. Yeah, we're already kind of here. So like this position. Knight h4 here. It's quite interesting. The problem, I think, is I can play check first, and then I take your knight with check. So you have to recapture, and then I go here. You actually just lose, I think. So it's a cool idea, but I think this is a problem. So knight h4 doesn't work. So they go for this, and knight takes d4 is indeed the move. Knight takes e3 is a similar version. The problem is that after takes, I think that black can play rook to a2. And this rook on the second is just too annoying. I think a position like this, you're just not going to win. You could play h3, but I'll play a3 for instance. Excuse me. And I think this is just not going to be winnable because you can do this, but now I simply bring my king up, and there's just no way to make progress. Your king can't really come up. And if you try to push your pawns, I just try to blockade them with the king. If your rook ever leaves the third, I play rook b2, rook a2. This kind of position is not really going to be winning. So you're not going to win that way. So he takes d4, which is the best try. But I also think this position should be drawn. But this position actually here is very, very important. So the question is, what is the correct move to play if you're black here? So if you play rook d5, then I think I'll check and I'll go here. And once my rook gets behind the pawn, I think I have really good winning chances. Not that it's a complete win just now, but I feel like this is going to be pretty good chances for white to win. So it's a little bit more accurate to play the move rook d8, so the rook can't go behind. And now I thought the best try was rook e5. If you play rook a3 or something like this and I play rook here, I just don't think you can win once again. Because I bring the king up. And you just really can't make progress in a position like this. Because if your king goes over to the queen side, eventually I'm just going to take your pawns. And if you try to play h3, I actually just kind of wait for you. I do this. If g4, I take king f6. And you just don't really have a way to make progress. If king e4, I check you and just move the rook back to a8. So here, what I'm talking about is something like check. And I can even just keep checking you if I want. And come here. And you're just way too slow to try to win this way. Actually, sorry. I could probably do this a bit more accurate. So something like check and then like rook here. The idea being that if you try to push the pawn, I go here. And this is going to be a dead draw. So this is one example. And if you try to come in like this, then I push my pawn here. And by the time you can give a check, but the problem is now a2, a1 is a threat. So you have to come back. So you just can never win these kind of positions usually. So that's why the best try is actually rook e5. Because now you're actually going to win 3 pawns. But the problem is after I play rook a8, you take on h5, king g7, and you come back. The problem here is that after king g6, g4, even though you get this, I can't take on f4 because of rook takes a2, but even this position, you just can never win. Because something like king here, h4, and now I just start attacking everything. So g5 check, king f5, you're not going to win anything. Rook takes f4 is a threat already. So because you're just going to take the f and g pawns, which is a dead draw. So you could try this, but I just give a check. And I just go back and forth. And you just can't really do anything. So even though you have 2 extra pawns, because your rook is so passive just sitting on a1, you can never really win. So this is an example of how the passive, like the rook on a1 is just so bad when the black rook's behind. So this is just... rook d8 would be a draw. But keep in mind, when these guys have no time to discover all this in the rook endgame, to see all these subtleties is very tough. He plays h4, which seems good. And Fabiano plays king g2, which also seems logical. But I think both these moves are blunders. After h4, I think that white, if they play rook e8 check first, and then king g2, I think white should probably win. Because there's no real way to stop the 2 versus 1 now. So for example, let's say you play check, take this pawn, for instance, and then a3. I simply go here. And now you could even bring your rook behind or play a2. But this kind of position, believe it or not, is actually quite easy to win, even with the pawn here. Because the main issue is you can just never make a threat. So here, for example, maybe I start by cutting your king off. You could just sit, right? I bring my king up. And now I just slowly push all my guys, right? Here, I'll go here. F5, rook a7, g4, and I just slowly push everything up the board. And you actually can't win. Wow, Leko saw it all at once. It's, I guess it's not surprising. He knows this stuff. Yeah, and if you try to win this way, or sorry, if you try to play this way, this is also not going to work because I go here. And now, for example, king f5. And the key is that after a2, I play g4, and you can't move your rook and attack a pawn. So you just have to sit, kind of. But then once this happens, you're just kind of toast. Because say if something like king here, I can simply play this, and here, and once again, you just don't work. Well, here's the difference. After king g2, Nepo has the opportunity to play the move rook d8, which he did. And now, once again, you're ready to get the rook behind the pawn, which should draw. And here, Fabiano played the move g4. If rook a3, the key here is that black can actually play the move rook d4. I think rook a4 might still... Because, yeah, the problem here is that if you play... so probably takes is actually good enough to draw as well. Something like this would also be good enough to draw, come to think of it. So this would probably draw as well. For the same reasons that we kind of saw before. After this, we go here. And we just kind of put the king on f5. And this should also draw, actually. So this would have been a draw. So that's why Fabiano plays g4. And here, Nepo plays a very accurate move. He plays the move rook b8. So the idea of this move is that he's ready to kind of give checks and do this kind of thing. And it prevents king h3. Because king h3, rook b3, you actually lose, which is funny. So Fabiano plays, again, a very clever move. He plays rook e4, which is correct. And here, Nepo only has one drawing idea. So what is the drawing move for Nepo? And he misses it. And it's amazing the subtleties and the difference between what he got and what would have been a draw. Because it's actually amazingly different. Yes, rooks belong behind passed pawns. However, he played the move rook a8 here, which is a blunder. The correct move is a3. And this would have drawn. Because, for example, if here, king h3, now you play rook a8. And if rook e1, a2, king g7, and we have the same idea we had before. King takes h4, king g6. And this position is actually not winnable for the same reasons I showed you. That if the king comes back, I cut you off, and I'll play rook a4 or rook a3 till the end of time. And if you try to play something like f5 check and I go king f6, you just have no way to make progress. Because I'm ready to queen already. So this would have been a draw. After a3, rook a4 is what I assume was the try. But now I can play rook b3, and this rook on b3 is actually quite strong. The idea of rook b3 is that now if you try to play f5, for instance, king g7, you actually have no way to win. Because say g5, h3 check, for instance, king f7, and you just can't win. Because the second you try to do something, like let's say you play rook a7, king f8, g6, now I play rook b5. And if f6, I play rook f5 check. So you get a position where you just have a passed h-pawn, which is not nearly enough. This is a dead draw. So this whole thing with a3 would have been a draw. But he plays rook a3, and now Fabiano plays rook e2. And this is the key point. You stop the pawn when it's on a3 and not on a2. And because he has this extra tempo, it actually proves to be quite an easy win. Because once you do this, rook a4, king g3, there's no check along the third rank. And because there's no check along the third rank, white has all the time in the world to advance these pawns. So it turns out this pawn being one square farther back causes the game, instead of being a draw, to be a loss. And it's actually quite simple. He just keeps pushing. Like anyone could win this position probably. Check, h5 check. So if king here, he would have just played this move probably, because you can't take on f4 because I take here. And then king g5 or g5 check, whichever gets allowed. So he plays king f6, but he plays king h4 anyway. Rook goes back to a8. f5, so now he's going to try to play this. g5. He doesn't even care about getting cut off, which is really funny. Because there's just no way to ever stop these pawns now. They're just too far. And the problem is, because this pawn is here, white can afford to go here at the last minute. So I'll show you what I mean. He plays king g8. g6, king h8. This looks silly, but there's just nothing he can do. King f3. King here. And the reason he played king f3, by the way, is because after f6, which he'd love to play, this move I think he found problematic, with the idea that at f7 you have check. So he plays king f3 to sidestep that. King to g8. f6. King h8. He fell in the overall match. He won this particular game, but he fell out in the overall match. And now is where he plays rook e2. And the whole idea is now he threatens mate. So after rook a8, he plays f7, and the game is over. So he resigned because rook e8. What's really funny is this f7 move would be a blunder, probably, if this pawn weren't here, because then you could start checking and just like give away your rook anywhere. So it'd actually probably allow a draw. So it's actually quite funny that this is the winning move. So you can see how, because the pawn was on a3 and not a2, he was able to win. And this really goes to show with these rook endgames how subtle they are. Because the idea of putting the rook behind the pawn was absolutely correct at first, but a few moves later, it was actually a blunder to put it behind the pawn. And he should have played a3 with the idea of rook b3. The king could go to f8, but rook e8 check is still a drawing move, yeah? So I don't think it would matter. But yeah, I mean, obviously with the pawn on a3, this is an easy win because rook e8 is going to win. So Fabi won this game and tied the match for yesterday. But today, Nepo was able to win the match and go to the semifinals. So that was that. But it was a really dramatic match and a really amazing game, like with lots of mistakes, lots of different things, but a lot of cool things to analyze. So it was a lot of fun analyzing this game. I hope you guys enjoyed it. This will be my last lectures for the club for a while, but I will do a couple more streams on Twitch. One will be Saturday at 4 p.m. I'll be doing a simul, and then Sunday I have the beginners classes and the intermediate classes at 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. and then the Puzzles Paradise at 5. Thank you, Davina. And thanks everyone. I appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you guys next time.